Hi, welcome to our one-day symposium, Moving Objects, Modes of Conveyance in the Making of Global Asias. I'm Crystal Parikh. I'm the director of the Asian Pacific American Institute at NYU, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here. Thanks so much for coming out on a Friday morning and joining us for these wonderful speakers we have lined up. Before I begin, I would like us to take a moment to acknowledge that the APA Institute at NYU is located on unceded land of the Lenape peoples. I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Lenape community, their elders both past and present, as well as future generations. And we'd also like to recognize that New York City is currently home to approximately 100,000 people who identify as indigenous, including many peoples from the Pacific. So there's more information if you would like to know more about the indigenous peoples of New York City. You could find more information in the QR code. So the Asian Pacific American Institute is delighted to host, in partnership with Pennsylvania State University's Global Asia's initiative, today's symposium, Moving Objects, Modes of Conveyance in the Making of Global Asias. This event is part of the APA Institute's two-year programming initiative on Asian Pacific American prospects. We are all sorely aware of the many and proliferating crises that face Asian Pacific American communities in these precarious times. The resurgence of ethno-nationalisms and authoritarian governments, political strife and turmoil, the devastating war and genocide in Gaza and in the Middle East, the worsening effects of climate change, this is an incredibly depressing list, and economic and social insecurities all pose profound challenges to imagining and planning for the future in the United States and around the world. But we at the APA Institute at NYU have also been heartened and inspired by the ways in which Asian Pacific Americans have brought hard-earned wisdom and creative energy to their research, studies, politics, and artwork to offer us diverse and powerful perspectives for facing these crises. With Asian Pacific American prospects, we collaborate with scholars, students, activists, and artists who share their knowledge and visions towards creating equitable and sustainable futures for all of us. So the APA Institute has several more programs coming up this semester, including a publishing workshop for graduate students and an event featuring visualizing Palestine. Guests can learn more about our programs from our website and from our social media. Okay, so I have a few acknowledgements, thank yous that I wanted to make before we move forward. First, my deepest thanks to Penn State's Global Asia's Initiative, Jess Rafalco and Tina Chen, and our 7 presenters today from NYU and from across the country who are joining us, as well as the panel moderators, Jun Young, Veronica Kim, and Krishnendu Ray. I also want to extend all my deep gratitude to the APA staff at the Institute. Folks may or may not know that I'm winding down my tenure as director after 7, 8 years, depending how you're counting, at APA Institute. And I just want to say what a pleasure and an honor it's been to work with, just really talented professional staff, Amita, Laura, Damien, as well as our incredible student staff. Every year we have just like a new crop of really amazing, talented students. So thank you to all of you, and it's just been a pleasure for me to be able to have my last sort of public introduction be this event that I planned with Tina. Let me say, before I introduce Tina, I just want to go over the format for the symposium so you all know what's happening today. We'll have our first panel, it's from 10 to 12 today. There is a 2-hour lunch break, and the program includes restaurants and other places you could grab some lunch if you'd like in the area. We also invite you to check out the exhibits that our neighbors here on 20 Cooper Square on the 3rd floor have on display. Our colleagues at the Latinx Project are hosting 2 exhibitions. There's one in the gallery near the entrance here where you came in. You can view Yamera, or Almost There, featuring the work of LA-based artist Carla Diaz. And on the 1st floor, you're invited to view a group exhibition, Burning the Mask. And then our second panel will begin just right after noon. So we'll have our next set of speakers, and then we have a reception, and we welcome you to the reception at the end of the day. So, okay, and let me introduce Tina, who will be introducing Veronica. And I just, if I can wax sentimental for a minute, since I'm doing that already, I had the great pleasure of meeting Tina 25, maybe closer to 30 years ago, and dating us when I was just finishing up grad school. And I think Tina was maybe just in her first year as an assistant professor at a very small conference, and I think it was Eastern Shore of Maryland. We just sort of started talking at a panel and have been friends ever since. So it's just been really a tremendous pleasure to organize our own symposium and invite all these talented speakers. It's just been a joy to work with Tina and Jess. So. And with that, let me say that Tina Chen is the director of Penn State's Global Asias Initiative, founding editor of the award-winning journal Verge, Studies in Global Asias, and the co-editor of Global Asia's Method, Architecture, Praxis book series. She's interested in speculative fictions and imaginable geography of global Asias and developing a more capaciously imagined scholarly praxis. And over the last decade, she has been conceptualizing global Asias as and through alien form, an approach that leverages the structural dissonances of generic frictions to help us reimagine the genres of scholarly labor, even as they paradoxically operate to remake generic distinctions as we know them. So you can read more about this in her latest project, which is coming out later this year with Duke University Press, Alien Forms and Minor Genres, a speculative handbook of academic labor. And I think folks also know Tina as an incredible award-winning mentor of students and just a generous and thoughtful collaborator. So please welcome Tina Chen.
Thank you so much, Crystal, for that beautiful introduction. And I see from the instructions I'm supposed to be doing the next introduction. Before I do, I want to reiterate some of the thanks that Crystal has already articulated, especially to the APA staff and Amita, who has done a tremendous job in putting this together. I also want to sort of give you guys a little bit of context for how this symposium came about. So we imagined creating this symposium not just because we wanted to hang out and work together, Crystal and I, but because we thought about the ways in which we could maybe create an event that would work to support a future special issue of Verge. So right now we're in the process of putting together a special issue it's called Things That Matter, Materiality and the Making of Global Asias. And so we thought, well, what might happen if we could maybe focus on a particular set of objects and thinking about materiality in that way. And that led us to thinking about moving objects and why we're sort of focused on modes of conveyance and the making of global Asia. So I think initially we had a maybe more narrow idea of like what moving objects would be. We were inundated with all of these amazing proposals for projects, which led us to sort of like have a more expanded view of what moving objects could be. So I'm really excited to sort of see and hear all of the papers today and get to think about sort of like what those more capaciously imagined sense of objects could help us think about in relationship to both movement and materiality. That does create more pressure, though, because we're trying to take all of these papers and turn them into a feature for this special issue. And so one of our challenges, I think, that we'll be tackling is how to sort of like bring all of this stuff together and still make it coherent. So again, it's a challenge that I'm looking forward to. Okay, so my stated task here is to introduce our moderator, and I'm really excited to introduce her. Junyoung Veronica Kim is a visiting clinical assistant professor of East Asian Cultures and Liberal Studies at NYU, and she will be joining the Department of Asian and Asian American Studies at Binghamton University as an assistant professor of Korea and Diaspora Studies in fall 2026. Her book in progress, which is called Cacophonous Intimacies, Reorienting Diaspora and Race in Asia, Latin America, centers Asian diasporas in Latin America, revealing the intimacies between seemingly disparate histories of multiple imperialisms, hemispheric American settler colonialism, and post-colonial nation building in both East Asia and Latin America. So our first panel is focused on objects moving people, and so I'm going to invite all of the speakers for the first panel to come up here along with Junyoung Veronica.
So I hope everyone is doing well today. It's on Friday. It's a beautiful Friday. Tomorrow it's going to be raining, so enjoy today. I want to thank, before we begin, both Crystal Parikh and Tina Chan and the APA Institute at NYU and Global Studies at Penn State for making this possible. As you know, it's a lot of work to put together a symposium bringing people from all over the country. So thank you very much. And I will be moderating, so I will be the master of ceremonies, hopefully. So before we begin, I want to introduce the first speaker. So the first speaker is Anel Rakhimzhanova, who's a PhD candidate in performance studies at NYU, researching modernity, mobility, and performance at Central Asia. She is the editor of the exhibition catalog Almalgul Melibayeva, I Understand Everything. Her writing has appeared in Art Margins and Soviet Materialities. So she will be presenting the first paper.
Thank you, everyone, for having me. And thank you for APA for organizing this beautiful symposium. On May 29, 1873, the Times reported that Ferdinand de Lesseps is said to be coming before the world again with a project which will throw his own Suez Canal entirely into the shade. He proposed to bring London within a week's journey to Calcutta via a railway from Orenburg to Peshawar, settling the Central Asia question forever and extinguishing all sources of jealousy between England and Russia. The Central Asia question refers to the debates between the two empires over colonial interests across India, Afghanistan, and Turkestan, as well as the regional influence of China and France. The very framing and exonym of Central Asia came from continuous demarcations of imperial borders and zones of influence, Inner Asia signifying the areas of China's involvement, Srednya Asia or Middle Asia defining the territories conquered by the Russian Empire, and Central Asia as the lands yet to be colonized. The French entrepreneur de Lesseps was a short-lived character in Central Asian history, as neither of the empires was in favor of a joint railway system. He then moved to another topographic intervention, the catastrophic Panama Canal. Beyond being a marker of interconnected imperial histories, de Lesseps' unrealized railroad opens a discursive floor for the logistical rationale in reorienting Central Asia into managed territory of potential flows. Logistics is a form of spatial and material organization based on a circulative rationale. For things and people to be moved, they need to be abstracted into calculatable units for dislocation. While Russian colonial rule throughout the late 19th and early 20th century established a bureaucratic infrastructure to account for the population and resources, the railways shifted the very rationale of moving and being moved. Movement here becomes a broad spectrum of gestures attributed to unstable terrains, nomadic living, or oriental slowness, in some cases a prerequisite and in others an obstacle to establishing new values of mobility, the ones accessible via trains and capital. I unpack these earlier expressions of logistical rationale, which I define as modes of reading and misreading existing movements towards a representation of space in terms of the controllable circulation of resources. This is, of course, not to say to root all the current conditions of the global circulation fully to Russian and later Soviet imperial history. Although it begins with colonial intervention, the logistical rationale is not limited to the external conquest of space. A technocratic reasoning becomes equally important for Central Asian intellectuals in envisioning their autonomous modernity through global flows. The unified network of Russian railroads created a cohesive idea of the imperial territory and what historian Fritjof Schenk calls mental maps upon which travelers and migrants conceptualize the state's geographical and cultural frontiers. Svetlana Gorsheniana similarly argues that the regulation of Western travelers via the railway meant they interacted with the region through the stations and towns with colonial presence, as opposed to less predictable caravan trips, leading to the standardization of literary and symbolic representations of Russian Turkestan. Central Asia's role as a vital logistical hub originated with the Silk Road trade networks and later drove Russians, as well as other imperial pursuits of a passage to India. An ambition that evolved from Peter the Great's hydraulic visions of the waterway through Caspian Sea into later development of regional railways. Aside from financial benefits, Russian technocrats argued for the railroad's role in the systematic colonization of the region, stating that a link to an intellectual, economic, and governance center would lead to Russification of Turkestanis and catalyze the settler colonial movement comparable to North America. Critics of frictionless construction noted the Russian army's grueling experiences in harsh Central Asian environments and the persistent threat of Turkmen and Kazakh resistance. Hungarian Turkologist Armin van Bury also argued that there is an ontological incompatibility between the acceleration drives of European and American modernity and the haste awareness of Asians. In Asia, where, quote, humankind can hardly be sedentarized and is always inclined to a nomadic lifestyle, such infrastructure is not feasible. Liveliness, ardent care, and thoughts about the future are such qualities that neither the railway, the hot balloon, nor anything else in the world can bring to them, end of quote. In other words, with a new kinetic regime entering the imagination of Central Asia, the Orientalist narratives both highlighted the mobility of indigenous populations while making them incompatible with logistical modernity. While Russia and Britain deployed industrial warfare in their increasingly unequal conquests against the Central Asian people, their logistical capabilities remained entirely dependent on camel transport provided by local pastoralists as an often overlooked logistical dependency. This dynamic shaped the construction of the Trans-Caspian military railway along caravan passes. Enabled by camel power, this infrastructure facilitated the Göktürk siege and the massacre, where survivors were later forced to reenact their defeat for train passengers, turning industrial logistics into a colonial spectacle. Turkestan emerged as a profitable cotton colony following the American Civil War, but that wasn't a driver of the conquest. Commercial viability was narrated as Russia's greater civilizational purpose in Central Asia, envisioned in making arid steppes and deserts bloom by transferring rivers and extending railroads. In Marxist-Leninist analytical tradition, Soviet historiography later reduced the colonization of Central Asia to purely economic reasons, framing it as a necessary lesser evil to British imperial ambitions, replacing the term conquest with a framework of uniting of Central Asia to Russia, generally claiming its progressive significance. Turkestanis were excluded from the discussions of logistical construction by state-run press, while later progressivist pan-Turkic newspaper Tarjuman framed European railways and military technologies as universal scientific advancements rather than inherent tools of Russian colonial subjugation. Ultimately, the railway did not just bind the territory to the Russian heartland, it catalyzed a new resource-mindedness that both straightened and challenged imperial control through its profound impact on local ecosystems and regional economies. At the end of the 19th century, native Turkestanis began using rail for business and travel, including the incorporation of steam into the Hajj pilgrimage journeys. Quote, the advent of the printing press, the railway, the telegraph, and the modern postal system transformed knowledge production and transmission patterns and allowed the Islamic reformist Jadid's movements, meaning new method, to redefine the nature of cultural production in their society. In the Islamic interpretation of progress, railroads were used as an evolutionary example, a technology already outrun by aeroplanes, thus showing the constantly evolving power of human knowledge. Quote, only after humanity had progressed to a certain level was it ready for God's final message, end of quote. Geography also redefined the Jadid's worldview by introducing modern concepts of finite space and global interconnectedness through maps and globes. Jadid's logistical rationale centered on the belief that modern power was a product of spatial and systematic mastery, requiring colonized people to adopt the same cartographic and organizational tools used by Europeans for their own liberation. Similarly, Muhammadjan Tanishbayev, the first Kazakh railway engineer and political figure, educated nomadic Kazakh readers on technological advancements. Tanishbayev's articles discussed logistical technologies such as railroads, flying machines, armored cars within the ongoing warfare in Europe, Japan, and the Balkans, not simply describing them, but teaching readers how to use these tools amidst World War I mobilization of colonial alien subjects. There are no exotization or simplification of the process for readers who might be drafted. The logistical rationale was equally a demand of time for the national movements as well as their method of understanding and surviving in industrial empires. I position logistical rationale not merely as a technical apparatus for moving goods, but as a primary ontological engine for Central Asian modernity. I argue that the colonial production of place was achieved through strategic territorialization, where imperial powers sought to override environmental and population mobility with rigid flows. Yet the very infrastructures designed for colonial extraction and surveillance served as a material substrate for counter-logistics. Local intellectual and political actors did not simply resist these networks, they utilized the speed and connectivity of imperial corridors to circulate subversive ideas and forge trans-regional political consciousness. This complicates the subsequent primitive narrative of the Soviets towards Central Asians and their liberatory positions. Thank you.
Our second presenter is Ngoc Tran, who's a University of California President's Postdoctoral Fellow in Asian American Studies and Asian Languages and Cultures and University of California, Los Angeles. She earned her PhD in American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California in 2025. An interdisciplinary historian of Vietnam's multiple diasporas in the late 20th century, she is currently working on a book titled Non-Arrival, Histories of Drift and Disappearance After the Vietnam War, which seeks to denaturalize a relationship between refugees and resettlement by examining the multimodal history of oceanic movements into, across, and under the South China Seas. Her dissertation received the 2025 Ralph Henry Gabriel Prize for Best Dissertation by the American Studies Association.
All right, hi everyone. Thank you for having me here and also to the wonderful organizers for this symposium. My presentation today examines a very understudied aspect of the Vietnamese boat refugee exodus, which are the material histories of the vessels that were used by, carried, and also transformed by nearly 1 million people who fled Vietnam and as well as other Southeast Asian states by sea between 1975 and 1995. So my initial interest in this project grew out of two moments of curiosity. The first being a testimonial encounter with two survivors who described their journeys to Hong Kong in dramatically different circumstances. One escaping on a 10 by 13 meter sampan, and the other on a 3,000-ton rusted freighter named the Huy Phong. Both, however, described themselves as boat people. The second moment of curiosity emerged during a trip to Vietnam several years ago, and when in a conversation with my uncle, I kept being corrected when I would point at vessels docked at the harbor and called them Thuy, which is the common identifier for a boat, and also Thuy Nhung, which is boat people. And coming from a fishing family, he wanted me to get it right? This is ghe, that's chiếc bờm, that's Thuy đánh cá, that's Thuy tàu, and not just any boat. So he was very particular about that. So these two encounters helped me realize a pretty critical gap in the ways that histories and narratives have been told about the Vietnamese boat refugee experience, which is the tendency to collapse vastly different maritime forms into a single category of migration, whether that's the boat migration or boat people exodus, which leaves material and also experiential specificities out of the picture, as well as wartime and post-war genealogies under-examined. The make and function of boats were, as I argue, highly dependent on access to capital, informal supply chains, while survival at sea would rely on social networks, logistical encounters, and also the presence of skilled engineers or fishermen who could repair broken engines and navigate the sea in situations of precarity. So as a result, the history of the Vietnamese refugee diaspora, and by extension, of past and current oceanic migrations undertaken by people desperate for livable futures, must contend with the materiality of vessels that could at once shape and also restrain and constrain daring acts of flight and survival. And by doing so, we can pay attention to the diverse and complicated social and material worlds that these migrational objects themselves built and carried, including political and economic relations between states and people, as well as informal supply chains that circulated within and beyond nation-state borders. So let me begin. Much of what we know about the diversity of coastal vessels in Vietnam comes from archaeological and ethnographic research conducted during the period of French colonial rule in Vietnam, when French cartographers produced copious maps and documents about Indo-Chinese naval construction as a way to know and thus discipline the seemingly exotic ways of the colonized native. A naval officer named Francois Edmond Paris, who was in charge of collecting a lot of this data, deemed these cultures excitingly extra-European and thus deserving of preservation for France's ethnographic nautical knowledge. This body of work distinguished a wide range of watercraft on the Vietnamese coast, where vessels were closely tied to specific regions, provinces, towns, and ports, and shaped by unique sociocultural contexts despite a seemingly homogeneous topography of the land. Paris's hundreds of line drawings and reproductions of the boat builds gathered in the late 1800s would come to influence colonial maps such as the one shown here. When the American War in Vietnam began, French archaeological study ended, But the work of demystifying the coastal and inland vessels of Vietnam would come to serve strategic goals of US counterinsurgency in Vietnam, producing works of classification that would shed light on the type of vessels later used by refugees escaping. A field survey conducted in 1966 produced the US military's 1967 Blue Book of Coastal Vessels, which provided detailed information on, quote, origins and evolution of South Vietnamese boats, fishing techniques and equipment, and also boat construction methods and materials. Along with these topics, the US military classified 60 different types of boats that existed in the South alone, with distinct traditions borrowed from the Chinese to the north, the Cham in the heartland, and the Fulanese in the southwest, and the Indo-Malay Peninsula further south. These details also then made their way into the excerpted Green Book of Coastal Vessels, South Vietnam, created by the Advanced Research Projects Agency of the US Department of Defense to, quote, aid personnel who are engaged in patrol operations and in the stop and search activities in the coastal waters of South Vietnam. The reference book operated as a recognition manual for officers on patrol craft, aircraft, and naval boats. And they classified different types of wooden-hulled boats and intracoastal steel-hulled ships that operated in South Vietnam for securitization purposes, particularly in the Mekong Delta region, where the US military had a really hard time identifying NLF insurgents operating on the waterways. Patrol personnel would stop any boat that, quote, operated in a manner different from most boats of the same type, and were provided then a list of clues in ornamentation, sail pattern, or operating behavior that would indicate suspicious activity. One clue, for example, was an appearance factor denoted by, quote, classic Chinese junk type sails on any sailing craft, as many North Vietnamese boats would have this type of rigging. So if they saw that Chinese junk type sails, they would know that might be a suspicious craft. Inversely, the presence of, quote, a fancy boat operating in the northern area would warrant closer inspection, as northern boats are, quote, normally very austere, which meant the lack of engines, motors, or sail sophistication. Thus, through imperial knowledge production, these vessels themselves became indices of racial and political deviance, as well as signifiers of obedience or insurgence. After 1975, people fleeing from Vietnam used the same types of boats that had previously been categorized, surveilled, or modified with wartime parts. The maritime characteristics archived within these colonial and imperial documents are crucial for understanding the post-war exodus, as the same visual cues entered into new regimes of evaluation and regulation to aid officials' assessments, or border officials' assessments of refugee distress and need. For instance, most refugee boats intercepted by Hong Kong police in 1982, originally departing from Central and North Vietnam, would range from about 10 to 13 meters long and fell under the description of a motorized wooden boat, a sailing junk, or a fishing junk. And this is a reproduction of one of these interception reports that I found in the archives. Their varied sizes indicate different original functions, with smaller boats and weaker engines more suitable for small-scale trading, riverine cruising, or near-shore fishing, while larger vessels tended to be used for deep-water fishing and cargo transport. Most arrived in Hong Kong with broken boats or dying engines, or no engine at all. Most engines recorded by the Hong Kong interception officers were of Japanese design, the most popular of which were Yanmar or Kubota diesel engines, along with some engines suspected of Chinese origin, as well as Russian engines. As only government offices could purchase new engines in Vietnam at the time, the ones inserted into river barges for escapes were often old engines left over from the war or much earlier. On average, boats in northern and central Vietnam had considerably lower horsepower than those in southern regions, where large pre-existing fisheries, including the presence of the US military during wartime, had meant greater access to supplies for boat building from wartime to its conclusion. So you could draw parallels between which boats were supposedly larger, more advanced, with more horsepower, depending on where boats were coming in from. As escapes mounted throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, officers could also discern refugees' original departure point by the types of boats they used, which led Border Patrol in Hong Kong to sometimes categorize vessels as Hue type, Hai Phong type, or Da Nang type boats. Registration numbers, if boats had them painted on the hull, were easy giveaways. typically a combination of 2 alphabetical letters followed by 4 numbers. The first 2 letters indicated the province where the boats had been registered by local bureaus. For example, a boat with the number HP 1000 would be from Haiphong, DN 2000 Da Nang, NB from Nghĩa Binh. Border officials at neighboring shores could then discern what province or region Vietnamese refugees began making their journey by looking at the first 2 letters. Moving on to the parts of the boats itself. Engines and boats across Vietnam became really highly sought after commodities in a more repressive economic and political environment conducive to anticipatory departure, which is something I theorized in the larger project. Government authorities at times stimulated the growing appetite for boats, engines, and fuel. On many occasions, local police would sell confiscated boats to intermediaries to facilitate the escapes of hundreds or thousands of people, and then sometimes also commission boat makers to refurbish old rivercraft and wooden coastal boats to then sell them to organizers that would transport a group of people abroad. As a result of the substantial demand for boats, the business at boatyards across the Mekong Delta would boom in the late 1970s. Structural modifications, such as the fortifications of the sides of the boats, and then making makeshift platforms inside these vessels, were explicitly aimed at meeting the needs of clandestine escapes. There were features added to boat repairs in consideration of would-be refugees that would hide in the hold below decks, such as reinforced sides to prevent waves from crashing in, slim racks to hold occupants in place during the journey, ventilation pipes to funnel air into the hold, 2 toilets, and a cooking area. So these alterations by many of these refurbished boats reflected a deliberate transformation of many vessels into boats of escape, which were engineered to carry people away from their homeland with no intention of return. Thus, when clandestine departures would spike in the late 1970s, so did the boat building industry and the local commerce in refugee boats. And the trade and making of boats therefore effectively altered the material and social landscapes of post-war Vietnam. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Christopher Capozzola, who is the Elting H. Morrison Professor of History at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He is the author of Uncle Sam Wants You, World War I and the Making of the Modern American Citizen, and Bound by War, How the United States and the Philippines Built America's First Pacific Century. He also serves as the academic advisor to the Filipino Veterans Recognition and Education Project and co-author of its digital exhibition, Under One Flag, America's Broken Promise to the Philippines.
So I won't repeat all of the thanks from earlier this morning, but a special thanks. I've been a huge fan of Verge Global Asia's from day one, so it's really exciting to be here this morning. I will actually begin here. The first thing a visitor to Manila notices is the traffic. This is one of the first pictures I took on my first sort of extended research trip to the Philippines in 2008. And a global megalopolis of more than 14 million people, the average speed on the EDSA, the city's major ring highway, currently averages 12 kilometers per hour. Pollution levels are 3 times the threshold considered dangerous for health. As Manila struggles to claim its place in a globalizing world, cars are crippling its economy, weakening its public culture, and destroying its citizens' health. So it led me to this question: how did Manila get hooked on cars? And in particular, what do we learn by studying the history of traffic, or particularly the history of Trapik, right? This word, this English Tagalog sort of Taglish mix-up that I think opens a window into the relationship between the United States and the Philippines dating from the earliest days of the 20th century. I think my paper this morning examines the history of roads and automobiles in the Philippines. This morning I'll focus on the years between 1908 and the 1930s to explore the relationship between technology, imperialism, and modernity during the first years that American automobiles moved out beyond U.S. national borders. Now, my goal here is to bring together environmental history, the history of technology, and the history of U.S. imperialism, particularly to bring forward one of the central insights of that literature, which is interested in how empires and colonies make one another together, how they constitute one another. As the paper call noted in a quote from Noel Salazar, mobility must be materialized, and therefore I think that understanding cars along with the people who drove them, and understanding roads and the landscapes they remade is crucial to the question of materiality and movement that brings us all here together today. I'm particularly concerned with how global mobilities interact with national ones, with national ambitions, whether those are of imperial nation states or of post-colonial nation states, and national industries, particularly the auto industry, national industries that themselves embody national ambitions. And want to suggest that automobiles are a particularly valuable way for thinking about nation, empire, and mobility across global Asias, with my focus here on the Philippines. So, when American soldiers arrived in Manila in 1898, they found just a single railroad, which had been destroyed by Filipino revolutionaries in their battles with the Spanish military. Yet it is telling that at the height of America's railroad age, U.S. colonial administrators did not rebuild the railroad, or in fact really build any others either within or between the colony's cities. Now, there are geographic explanations for this, archipelagic reasons for this, and the Philippines was never likely to become a railroad-dominated nation. But Americans, nevertheless, very quickly turned their focus to the building of roads, hundreds of them. And in the initial years, the construction of roads was dedicated particularly to the task of occupying and pacifying the islands and destroying the Philippine independence movement in a brutal war of colonial suppression beginning in 1898, continuing to and past 1902. One U.S. colonial official complained that it was, quote, impossible to move through this roadless country, and Army engineers quickly went to work building roads dedicated specifically to supporting U.S. military conquest. It's telling that the Philippine Commission, the first civil government in the islands, U.S. civil government in the islands, passed a road law as its initial act of legislation in 1901. That is law number one. That's telling to me. And I think that this embedded an important set of assumptions and priorities that put U.S. colonial interests ahead of local needs. Now, what happens then is that I think a crucial turning point comes in the years immediately after this, as road building becomes part of what we might call the holy trinity of U.S. colonial benevolence, taking their place alongside schools and hospitals as important ideological justifications of U.S. intervention. And there are endless quotes in which those three in particular, roads, schools, and hospitals, are sort of explanations of what here you see President William McKinley's vision of benevolent imperialism. Now, in recent years, historians of the U.S. empire have examined this narrative of benevolence, not to argue against progress, but to understand how that was lived unevenly and unequally by the people it was intended to benefit. Historians such as Sarah Steinbach-Pratt and Alvita Akibo have examined American schools in the Philippines. Historian Warwick Anderson has encouraged us to ask tough questions about colonial public health. And Catherine Siniza Choi argues that efforts to improve medical education in the Philippines in the early 20th century laid the groundwork for a modern brain drain that fills U.S. hospitals with Filipino nurses while leaving Filipino populations without adequate access to health care. Now, it is difficult to argue against schools or hospitals or even good roads. And I'm not here today to do that. But what I want to suggest is that when we scrutinize the rhetoric of benevolence, we begin to understand the Philippines' contemporary crisis, its sort of mobility and environmental crisis, in new ways. And it helps us understand the United States a little better, too. And this is a crucial part, that road building and automobiles in the Philippines cannot be understood apart from the history of automobiles and roads in the United States. Colonial public works were not a simple transfer of an established technology to a developing region. U.S. automobile culture was itself the subject of political controversy and rapid technological change during precisely these years. There was a good roads movement that brought road building before state legislatures. Corrupt and monopolistic railroads were under scrutiny by muckraking journalists. Competitors in the emerging auto industry struggled for dominance. Now, mobility, broadly speaking, was a simultaneous, if multivalent, political project within the U.S. metropole and its newly conquered colony. And its technological forms, its material forms, from roads to carriages to to the automobiles that traversed them were as contingent as the empire that they constructed and served. All right, so let me spend a second on the roads themselves, and then we'll switch to cars, and then I will wrap up. So I'm particularly interested in actually who built the roads. What you see is an image here, and it's difficult to see from the back, but there are some very, very small people on a very steep cliff who are building a road into a mountain, the so-called Benguet Road that connects Dagupan with Baguio. It sort of connects the colonial capital in Manila with the colonial so-called summer capital in the mountains in Baguio. And the construction of roads sort of layers U.S. imperialism onto the history of Spanish colonialism that had preceded it. And that in the years before 1898, the Spanish colonial state had required every adult male to pay a prestación personal, a head tax, basically. And those without access to cash, which is almost everyone in the country, were expected to pay with a few days of labor instead. And a resistance to the prestación had been widespread before 1898, but it returns afterward as an aspect of both road building and of the kind of politics of tutelage for self-government that also conveniently leads to the extraction of substantial amounts of labor. Now, one key person to think about for this is, and you can see him on the very far left, John J. Pershing, who spent about 5 years in the southern Philippines between 1909 and 1913, where he combined the kind of head tax with a road building project and was particularly eager to sort of extract labor in order to connect the southern Philippines, largely made up of indigenous Muslim Moro populations, with the state and to defeat political resistance through the provision of infrastructure. Now, along the way also came substantial efforts to recruit laborers not only from within the Philippines but abroad. So in fact, the workers on the road to Baguio included both Chinese and Japanese contract workers, many of whom settled in the region or settled elsewhere in the archipelago over the years afterward. And so there's the kind of politics of road building labor along the way. But there's also substantial resistance, and I'm not going to talk about that this morning, but I think it's worth documenting, and historians Rebecca Tinio McKenna and Justin Jackson have documented kind of road building labor really nicely over the way. Now, the Baguio Road, nevertheless, becomes a remarkable sort of instance of imperial self-congratulation upon its construction. And here we see an image of some sort of trucks that are headed up the road. These are, notice, these are Mercedes-Benz trucks with a remarkably blingy sort of signal on the front. I think the message about quiet luxury didn't get through. But notice, this also brings us now to the questions of cars, right, and of vehicles and what's actually on these roads. And the remarkable fact that very few of them are American cars through most of the American colonial period. And so the key kind of turning point here is with an individual by the name of Warwick Green. Warwick Green was sort of born to a distinguished Rhode Island family, a Harvard graduate. 1 minute left. Okay, I'll do my best. Green becomes the director of public works, despite no training as an engineer, but is particularly important in actually setting up the processes for the importation of U.S. automobiles all the way from the United States to the Philippines. And the other part that Warwick Green does quite remarkably is establish a dynamic of infrastructure politics. That is, I want to spend my last 1 minute on, which is giving local municipal officials, Filipino sort of municipal officials working closely with the U.S. colonial state, clear incentives to lobby for local road construction projects in their home provinces, setting in motion a long-term relationship between electoral politics, political patronage, and public works development in Philippine political culture. Now, this is not unique to any country in the world, but I think it's worth particularly thinking about for part of this project about materiality and mobility. All right, so let me just conclude, and I want to conclude. I will conclude very briefly 3 ways. Right? So first, one way to conclude is here. This is an image of the Escolta in Manila in 1930s. Manila's modern Art Deco shopping promenade. Notice there are still both cars and carriages, multiple technologies at once. Notice also that everyone is driving on the left. Right? That shift from driving on the left to driving on the right happened on March 10th, 1945, as the US military occupation brought tens of thousands of American Jeeps into the country, along with American drivers accustomed to the right side of the road. Framed as a safety decree, this one paragraph message was in fact actually, by some metrics, marks the height of US political power, sort of announcing that as of today, all drivers will stick to the right-hand side of the road. A second place to conclude could be with the history of the jeepney, right? Most of which many come from World War II. The streets of highways of Manila today are clogged with these remarkable vehicles, and everyone will tell you the same story of where they come from. After the Second World War, the US Army sold or abandoned its fleet of jeeps, and Filipino drivers adapted them for use as informal jitneys or jeepneys. Now, some drivers boast that the jeepneys they drive today date from World War II. That is actually not possible. None of them actually do anymore. The American Motor Car Company, AMC, exported jeeps from Detroit until the 1970s, and most today are manufactured in the Philippines. To grab passengers' attention, drivers paint jeepneys in outlandish colors, decorating them with the names of their wives, their children, their hometowns, their patron saints. And in the decades since the war, the jeepney has become, for Filipinos, a cherished national icon, which, when you think about it, is kind of ironic. On the one hand, there is no clear illustration of the legacies of war and colonialism. A US Army vehicle imported during invasion, abandoned by the occupiers, and yet still somehow beloved by the occupied. But a jeepney would be unrecognizable on American streets. It is a distinctively Filipino vehicle, built on an American platform, but adapted to Filipinos' needs and dreams. And in all my trips to the Philippines, I saw jeepneys in almost every color, but I almost never saw one decorated in the stars and stripes of the American flag. Now, the third place to end is on the roadway itself. American automobiles remade landscapes, labor forces, and policies far away from Detroit, and the legacies of colonialism are complex. The 1950s brought new transfers not only of automobiles, but of auto factories as engines of development. Here you see the city's main highway in the years right after the Second World War. 1986 brought Filipinos to the street, to EDSA for a revolution. 1 million people blocking the roads. If you look, there's maybe one or two cars in this entire picture, if you look very, very closely. And yet also, in moments of hope come also decades of reflection and disappointment, as we see EDSA in 2024, a wall of automobiles that speaks to the entanglement of national histories and the ensnarement of something everyone refers to as Trapik. Thank you.
Our last speaker is Julia H. Lee, who is Professor of Asian American Studies at University of California, Irvine, and the author of 3 books. The most recent one, The Racial Railroad, and the second, Understanding Maxine Hong Kingston and Interracial Encounters, Reciprocal Representations in African Asian American Literatures, 1896 to 1937. She co-edited Asian American Literature in Transition, 1850 to 1930, a choice outstanding academic title. Currently, she is working on 2 projects. The first argues that politically maligned Asian diasporic figures that appear in COVID-era Asian American cultural production make clear the contronym qualities of Asian racialization. The second focuses on the contemporary Asian American neo-frontier narrative.
Thank you. So just to echo everyone, my thanks to both Crystal and Tina and the wonderful staff who made this whole process very easy for the speakers. So I actually, I have a QR code so you can access the slides. Don't get too excited, my slides are super, super basic. So I just want to acknowledge Gina Kim, who gave me the idea for this QR code. So you can just look at them on the screen, but if you want to be able to access them from your own personal device, you're welcome to do so. So my remarks today consider how the railroad offers key insights, I'm just going to start my timer, into the meaning of mobility in global Asias. I'm working from the premise, as all of us are, that just as movement across space and over time is not a straightforward proposition in a global Asia's context, the vehicles that carry that movement are not static, inert receptacles that simply move forward or backwards. systems of conveyance, planes, trains, automobiles, and boats, and I think this panel has covered almost all of them except planes, have, quote, trajectories, propensities, or tendencies of their own that are not reducible to the pure function of getting people from point A to point B. The train is thus an example of vibrant material, to borrow Jane Bennett's term, that demands our attention within a field premised on migration. Okay, so I focus on the railroad in this talk because, as I've argued elsewhere, the train encompasses a number of characteristics that can productively scaffold explorations of race, indigeneity, and power. The reasons for this are numerous, but I want to highlight a couple here. I told you it was going to be super basic. First, the railroad is uniquely multiscalar, both materially and conceptually. It is a system that can span a continent, as well as a technical assemblage of seemingly minor mechanical parts. It runs on tracks that Nana Verhoef describes as, quote, a visual imagining of endlessness, and it also contains spaces that in the 19th and early 20th century frequently resembled a sitting room. This leads me to my next point, which is that the train is polyvalent, meaning it signifies and functions across categories of human perception and the environment. And I have some examples here. So the train is symbolic, and you probably recognize this final image from the Alfred Hitchcock film North by Northwest, which is a symbol of masculine prowess. We know what's happening on the train right at that moment as the train goes through the tunnel. Another example of the train as a symbol is this image titled East and West Shaking Hands, which is an image. This is, of course, the completion of the first transcontinental railroad, a symbol of national unity, manifest destiny, U.S. technological prowess. We have the train as a spatial category, right? This is an image of a Jim Crow train car in the U.S. South during the middle part of the 20th century. The train is also infrastructural. This is Stieglitz's Hand of Man. And if you'll pardon the really bad gif, the train is also material. And here we have one of the final scenes from Bong Joon-ho's film Snowpiercer, in which we make the horrifying discovery that children have replaced parts on the train that never ends. Second, and more importantly for my purposes, the train as an infrastructural project captures a number of contradictions related to its status as a, quote, juggernaut of modernity. That's Anthony Giddens. And the image, I have an image here. The image on the right is from a series titled States of Mind, The Farewells by Umberto Boccioni, pardon my pronunciation, in which the train, you can see the engine number at the front, is imagined as a form of abstracted modernity. One of these contradictions centers on the train as a hyper-visible representation of settler colonial, national, and imperial claims to territory and authority. And an example of this would be this image, which is a lithograph across the continent from the workshop of Currier and Ives. So it's a hyper-visible representation of these settler colonial and national and imperial claims, as well as an example of what Hannah Appel, Nikhil Anand, and Nikhil Gupta have called hard infrastructure. And this is defined by the train's relative invisibility in day-to-day life, an invisibility that only fails at the moment that infrastructure fails. So I'll just note here that even when infrastructure failures are spectacular, they inevitably become invisible or slow in the way that Rob Nixon talks about slow violence. So there are many examples of this type of structural failure, but one of the most recent was the Norfolk Southern train derailment. Some of you may remember this, that occurred in East Palestine, Ohio, February 3rd, 2023. And the resulting fire from that derailment released over 100,000 gallons of toxic materials into the air, soil, and water, leading to mass evacuations and several deaths. But of course, the spectacular is the fire, and then the slow leakage and the pollution of the land and the poisoning of people is the slow part of that, and it becomes invisible again. To put it another way, the train is quotidian and ordinary, You cannot drive anywhere in this country without traveling next to or over train tracks, and my guess is you're so used to seeing them, you don't even notice them when you do. But the train is also hyperbolic, the very image of fantasies about individual freedom, national superiority, and technological progress. So the train's ability to encompass these contradictions is no less evident in global Asia's context. It could be said that the railroad enabled the emergence of a modern global Asia historically, starting with the construction of the first transcontinental railroad between 1863 and 1869 in the United States, or the Uganda Railway in British East Africa, which was built between 1896 and 1901. That's present-day Kenya. Both of these massive projects of nation and empire triggered the migration of tens of thousands of Chinese, Punjabi, and Gujarati laborers to North America and Africa, respectively. At the same time that it's a historical artifact of global Asia's then, the train also offers a conceptual framework for understanding the issues that characterize migration in communities as they currently stand. And here I want to turn my thoughts regarding the railroad's ability to both historicize and theorize global Asia's on a particular contradiction that the railroad highlights, and actually that many of my co-panelists have discussed as well, namely the imbrication between mobility and carcerality. So two recent historical novels explore this very question. Straw Dogs of the Universe, published in 2023 by Chinese-American writer Ye Chun, and Dance of the Jacaranda, published in 2017 by Kenyan journalist Peter Kamani. Has anyone read either novel by any chance? Okay. So while we tend to think of these two words, carcerality and mobility, as being oppositional in their meaning, the railroad's presence in what could be called global Asia's novels seem to suggest otherwise. So both novels have kaleidoscopic plots and an expansive, multi-generational cast of characters. Both also have male protagonists, Gui Feng in Straw Dogs and Babu in Dance, who make the perilous journey from their homes in China and Punjab in order to build the Transcontinental Railroad and the Uganda Railway, respectively. Let me just note here that I recognize that there are significant geographical, cultural, and historical differences between the two novels and the events that they represent, and I'm not going to be able to address them here. Nevertheless, there is a thread woven through these works that has to do with the co-constitution of carcerality and mobility. Gui Feng and Babu represent their migration as the result of their own free will and desire to see the world. However, that seeming mobility is premised on a fundamental constraint that deeply embeds them in the terrain of settler and colonial violence from which they must work. The railroad structures a mobility premised on fixing them into the nation and empire rather than moving them simply across empire or the nation. And this fixing process deepens the entanglements between Gui Feng and Babu and the settler colonial societies that constantly require their presence even as they reject them. So constraints of time, and I have about 2 minutes left, mean that I only can point your attention to a few passages, and I'm going to focus on Dance of the Jacaranda. So the Uganda Railway is a monument to British imperialism, built as a bulwark against competing European colonial powers, particularly the Germans, a corridor for opening the interior of Africa to English settlement, and a means for transporting resources and goods from the interior to Mombasa for transport off the continent. Unlike some Asian American narratives surrounding the first transcontinental, which tend to represent the railroad as a point of pride from a labor standpoint, despite the violence and exploitation that it represents, Dance of the Jacaranda highlights the suspicion and fear with which most Indian workers and Kenyan inhabitants viewed the railroad. While the British Museum proclaims, quote, "It is not uncommon for a country to create a railway, but this line," meaning the Uganda line, "actually created a country." So while the British proclaim it as that, the Kenyans refer to it as the Iron Snake, a beast that strikes villages, assaults women and children, and wreaks havoc on the land. Members of Parliament in London expressed a great deal of skepticism about the line's impact, given its enormous cost and questionable rationale, which is how this railway earned the nickname the Lunatic Line, by which it is also known today. So because the local Kenyan population was seen as unreliable and inexperienced in railroad construction, the British recruited workers from India, where railroads had been operational since the late 1830s, to carry out the labor. So the teenage Babu arrives in Mombasa with his new wife Fatima to construct the line, one of approximately 30,000 Indians who were brought to Kenya to work on the Uganda line. Because of a misunderstanding, the commissioner of the colony and the railway and superintendent, Ian MacDonald, suspects Babu of forging an alliance between the Indian and native Kenyan workers in order to foment rebellion against the colonial government. While he initially considers deporting him, Babu, back to Punjab, or holding him without charge and trial in a prison, which he has the right to do, MacDonald ultimately decides that the best way to monitor Babu is by allowing him to work on the railroad. The novel reveals how every step in his journey is dictated actually by the colonial apparatus. So while all of the South Asian workers are victims of systemic wage theft by the British authorities, MacDonald particularly targets Babu, reasoning that keeping him working and slowly impoverishing him is a more effective means of keeping him out of mischief than simply deporting or imprisoning him. And although Babu is aware that he is being underpaid like his colleagues, he doesn't actually recognize the extent to which he is being targeted. And I'll just point to a couple more passages. I'm not going to read them, but I just want to point out that actually working on the railroad gives Babu an extensive knowledge and very granular knowledge of the land that he is working on. The novel says he knows it like the back of his hairy hand, and it is this knowledge that ultimately helps him desert the railroad. So desertion rates, because conditions were so horrible, desertion rates on the railroad were incredibly high. And so the British came up with increasingly punitive means of trying to hold the workers to their contracts. But Babu is falsely accused of assaulting and impregnating a Kenyan chief's daughter, and then he flees to get away from the British authorities. I'm just going to, I apologize. I'm just going to end here, actually, by stating, so I want to conclude by ruminating on the possibilities offered by this interplay between transport and mobility and carcerality as a potential framework for theorizing a global Asia's novel. This is a narrative form that would have much in common, obviously, or would have connections to other types of novels, post-colonial novels, novels of the global South, but modes of conveyance seems like an entry point for imagining the connections within and between global Asia's communities. Thank you.
Forgive me if it's a bit of an uncomfortable question, but are you willing and able to talk about pirate ships, right? Because it seems to me that refugee boats exist in the materiality of refugee boats exists in direct relationship to the pirate ships. And I guess if you're willing and able, I guess I have sort of a two-part where number one, if you were able to find stuff about pirate boats, how did they enter the archive? Like, under what means were they able to be registered? And then number two, if you did find out about refugee boats, like, what were they like? Like, were they similar to, were they interchangeable with refugee boats? Could they be discerned? And so forth.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. Just a point of clarification, you're talking about pirate boats, like Thai fishermen around the same period. Okay, that's an excellent question, and that is, of course, it's an uncomfortable because it is a very sensitive area. Many refugee boats were attacked in the late 1970s and early 1980s when traveling, especially from South Vietnam to Malaysia and Thailand. And it was difficult even like from 1979 to 1982 to distinguish which Thai fishermen's boats looked like pirate ships, or pirate boats. And so therefore, a lot of the documentation that was submitted to border police in Thailand, it was often refugees were saying these were fisher boats that they expected to be just like, that would offer aid. So, refugees would hail these boats, please offer us aid, and then be surprised, and then, of course, unfortunately, robbed. Many of the women sexually assaulted in the process of many of the fisher boats coming close. So in the archives, many of the documentation surrounding what these types of boats looked like were generally described by witnesses, and either humanitarian organizations, or if refugees were willing to talk about it, especially for women, that was very difficult. If they were willing to talk about it, they would describe the boats in terms of where they were held. And often these fisher boats where women became carceral spaces, when women were locked in the hold for an indefinite amount of time, where very, very violent and brutal situations happened to them. And so these boats were then described in terms of their graphic and violent sort of imprisonment. And that was, in many parts, many times, how they were described. The boats, the pirate ships themselves and boats were described in relation to the refugee boats. But it is more often that you see the results of pirates robbing refugee boats and the consequences of that, which was, breaking the anchor and towing them out so far that the boats would fall apart because they were already, many of them, unseaworthy. And so that was a very these relationships often came about in very violent sort of situations, and that was how I often saw them in the records from both Southeast Asian archives and also the U.S. anti-piracy campaign archives. Thank you.
I wanted to talk first about your point about benevolent assimilation, right? There's a kind of school of thought that thinks about benevolent assimilation with respect to biopolitics, right? Like schools, hospitals, et cetera. But then, one of the things that your study on road building does is it actually points us to social reproduction, right? So schools, hospitals obviously kind of have an obvious kind of role in the social reproduction of Philippine coloniality, of Philippine subjectivity under American empire. But roads do something interesting, which is scaling out to roads and cars post-colonial implications. You touched on it a little bit in the EDSA context, right? But we were talking about this last night. Duterte in 2016 campaigned under the motto "Build, Build, Build," and he's not talking about schools. He's not talking about hospitals. He's talking about let's expand EDSA out. Let's create more toll roads, right? There's something about road building that indexes the social reproduction of an idea of national progress that begins from that colonial period. So I just kind of want to offer that as a way to think about its post-war implications beyond, right? The kind of obvious jeepney, right? And I think about traffic's kind of role in political life. For everybody, my question is, I want to invite you to ponder indigeneity's role in the way that infrastructures and mobility produce subjects via their circulation, right? That's kind of the magical thinking of globalization of infrastructure and mobility, right? And we know this in kind of global Asian American studies with mobility, right? The mobility of the Asian working subject is what produces everything from the coolie to the H-1B visa, right? But indigeneity here, I'm thinking about the work of Manu Karuka, for example, right? Especially in those middle chapters with the Cherokee, et cetera. But I'm also thinking about Jody Bird's work, right, the Trans-Siberian Empire. Indigeneity is indexed via mobility, via its interruption, right? They fall out of time because they interrupt national progress, they interrupt infrastructural development, and that kind of magical thinking of mobility and the circulation of infrastructures, right? It's what Deb Cohen and Winona LaDue call Wendigo infrastructure, right? That cannibalizing infrastructure. So I want to offer interruption, disruption, and indigeneity, but also kind of the way that they kind of scale out to kind of guerrilla movements like Idle No More, or in the Philippine case, right, all the kind of guerrilla movements in the Cordilleras against what would become road building projects towards Baguio. So using indigenous studies and indigeneity as an analytic to thinking about that for everybody. Thank you.
I guess I'll go first, which is unfortunate because they get time to come up with a better answer to those awesome questions. I guess I'll take your specific one for me, and I think two directions. One is I think it's important to think about road building and automobile use as also biopolitical projects, right? Sort of like the road laborer and the kind of, the formation of that identity, right, and the physicality of building those roads. But then also ways in which, and many people have written about this or theorized this, that driving creates certain kinds, assumptions of bodies and assumptions of sort of how we move through physical space. In terms of social reproduction, I think Yes, absolutely, right. There's a sense of the road, of roads as ways of creating, among other things, sort of multi-generational networks of work, right? That there will be jobs jobs building the roads as long as the state exists to build, right? And I also think there's a way in which it may be that in that holy trinity, roads do function ideologically differently because there is a kind of fantasy of the road as an apolitical undertaking, right? And I think that it could be that schools and hospitals were also originally theorized that way, but the politics of education, the politics of health and wellness, both in the United States and the Philippines, as from the early 20th century to the present, are just to keep erupting to the surface, right? Whereas there is a kind of, and I think we even see this, we can see it anywhere. This sort of fantasy of that that road building is an apolitical project, right? And so those are, and then I have probably something else to say about indigeneity, but particularly the ways in which there is both substantial resistance in sort of, non-automobilic communities to roads, right? Particularly to roads that aren't going to help them either, with establish or maintain their livelihoods, but also ways in which working on a road is something that colonial officials believe has a particular sort of transformative tutelary kind of impact, right? And I'm thinking particularly here of Mindanao, right, where Pershing's work there is crucial. It's more important that they build roads than farm, right? Which I think says something about the modernism of what Pershing is trying to undertake.
Yeah, I want to thank you for that question. It's a fantastic question. I think, Chris, you have this great phrase, like the imperialism, self-congratulation, right? And, the way in which imperialism uses these projects to sort of trumpet benevolent assimilation or sort of congratulate the sort of the authority that the settler state has over the land. But I think what is particularly, at least in the case of the railroad, is there's a real sense of panic about the inability of the settler state to hold the land, right? That it's constantly, there's a constant danger that the land is resistant somehow to categorization, to spatialization in the sense of modernity and empire. And so the railroad is like a response to that panic attack. Like it will hold, right, the land in a way that it will hold this land that has been resistant, right, to our attempts to colonize it. And so that is exactly what is happening in both of these instances. Because if you think about, and particularly when you think about the Uganda Railway, there was no, or even in Parliament was saying at the time, there's no reason for this railroad. It doesn't make any sense, right? From an economic point of view, for all these reasons, it's just completely out of scale with what is happening. And so it isn't just an example of sort of like this sense of like self-congratulation. I also see it as a sense of panic, right? And it's particularly panic about indigenous populations and their relationship to the land. And so I write about this in my book. I'm sorry to be that person, but yeah, there is a sense of actual anxiety. These are projects about anxiety more than they are, at least in the case of the railroad, like about self-congratulation.
Thank you for the question. And I'll address the question of indigeneity kind of in three different moments from like the colonial surveys of the space. And again, nomads play a lot of, first of all, to understand Central Asia, it's a landlocked region. So railroads play a fundamental kind of aspect of colonization and settler colonial movement. And again, because it was predominantly a nomadic population, there was a lot of like understanding of looking into caravan pathways, right? And also recruiting nomads to land service. And again, a lot of like big issues like how the sands move and whether you can stabilize both the quite furious the nomadic tribes, but also the landscape itself, right? So those questions are very fundamental at this colonial stage. But if we move a bit, and again, the workers were not recruited from the region itself because they seem as like they will be destroying it. So there were Persians who were coming to build it. There were Jewish and Ukrainian workers who were doing the Orenburg-Tashkent line. Later, if we look at the Soviet approach to railroads, Turksip, which is Turkestan-Siberian Railroad, becomes like this the first project of the 5-year industrial plan, and it is really this kind of central narrative of like liberation and like making the nomadic proletariat is seen as like we are the idea of settlement becomes very specific there, as there are like stations coming, and the labor force is finally recruited from the people living in the region. But at the same time, it happens at the moment of collectivization and forced sedentarization. So railroad is actually the refuge for people to get the food and the resources. And what we mean by collectivization, right, is like the whole livestock, which is both livelihood and mobility for nomadic population, is confiscated and sent over to Moscow and to Leningrad to build the social state, while at the same time on the ground people are merely surviving. But at the same time, again, it builds a station, it builds this kind of, again, multi-generational workforce and the idea of like belonging. So when you go to the stations nowadays, right, the kind of railroad museums, they hold the histories of the people who settled there. So it creates a different sense of belonging for the current people living. But and here I wanted to also shift to the question of the carcelarity and mobility with the Xinjiang issue, right? So when you're saying the indigeneity interrupts, right, we understand that the corpus of the carceral re-education centers, they go hand in hand with the China's industrial project and the building with the railroads, and the opening of the Xinjiang as kind of the hub, especially for the trade with the Central Asia. So that's why in my presentation I also mentioned that there are so many different layers of both national politics and kind of business interests and transnational alliances that have been happening to the fact that you can't really read through the colonial moment of the 19th century Russian construction what is happening now and the role of the transit in the current state.
My response is to sort of like thinking about indigeneity as disruption and interruption. The first point I'll make is that refugees are often legally defined as having crossed an international border, right? And then emerging from a singular known homeland, either by their national identification, in this case, Vietnamese from Vietnam. And in doing so, what that leads to is the erasure of the contested homelands within a particular nation state. And especially in the case of Vietnam, there are Cham, there are Khmer Krom, and there are Central Highlanders like Jarai and Ede who are never kind of seen in that corpus of refugees emerging from a particular nation state. And the second point I'll make to that is like building off the works of Maramas Mostuler and as well as Tiffany Lathabo King. Indigenous peoples are thought to be rooted in land and place, and therefore it disrupts. There is an inability for cultural discourses to think of indigenous peoples in diaspora. And as a result, there is less of the attention to the ways in which indigenous Asian diasporas complicate the ways that homelands and nation states are kind of conceptualized in like Asian American studies. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Leland. I had a question about your talk, Julia. I was interested in maybe hearing more about some of the differences in the ways in which the contradictions between mobility and carcerality kind of inform this dynamic between the ideas of coloniality and imperialism as relates to the Ugandan railroad versus the other, there's the transcontinental context you were talking about. Because in my head, you were saying that there was more suspicion towards the railroad in Uganda. My initial response was, given the time frame, that since it came after, if I'm remembering correctly, the Transcontinental Railroad, people would, given that it came after, they'd already be suspicious, realizing the problems of the railroad construction before. I was wondering, though, if you could elaborate more on what this, rather than it just be simply being a sort of temporal answer, what does the difference tell us about the historical context around imperialism and coloniality? Because I'm thinking about that even now with data centers and around AI. Because today, there's a lot of suspicion around when Silicon Valley comes into some like rural town.
Right.
But there's this new book by Dan Wang called Breakneck, where he shows how in China data centers are actually kind of prized because they bring mobility and kind of a new relation to the state for these like small regional geographies, mostly in the mountains. And then like their sort of climate is praised for being perfect for AI data harvesting. So there's a different kind of like imperial logic there.
Yeah.
Ironically, even coming after some of the developments in the U.S. So I'm just wondering, back to the railroads, what the story this tells us.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I don't think the resistance in the case of the Uganda Railway is necessarily chronological, like we see I think it's the particularities of British imperialism in Africa, right, as opposed to the U.S. What I think is happening in the case of the transcontinental and Asian Americans is this kind of sense of Asian racialization in this country being premised on being a perpetual foreigner, forever foreigner, right? And so this idea, which you can see in Asian American historiography and literary history, and this is what Manu Karuka's book is working really against, is this idea of claiming the land via the railroad, right? And so you will see, or you will read, Asian American narratives about the railroad that are very much about, it's a version of model minority politics, basically, right? The claim to U.S. citizenship is premised on participation in this tremendous infrastructural project, even though it was an unjust one and an exploitative one. Nevertheless, Asian Americans or Asians built it, right? Chinese men built it. And so that is part of one of the key differences, right? Within, and that's particular, I say that is something that is particular to Asian racialization in the U.S. that is not a part of the dynamic in the Uganda Railway, right? In the case of the Uganda Railway, the British did not want to hire native, like the tribesmen. They, not only because they were viewed suspiciously and there was always the possibility of rebellion, but also because they were not seen as technologically advanced enough to be able to handle the work, and South Asians, the Punjabi and Gujarati men were brought in precisely because of that history of railroad building in India at the time. And so the fear of, at least as represented in the novel, is always of a potential for those two labor forces to join and overthrow the British government, the British colonial authority. And so there are a number of differences at work, which again, I gesture to only in a sentence in the talk, but I think need to be explored in a lot more detail. And so yeah, that would be my initial response to that. Thank you. Yeah.
The detail around the fishermen's vessels having more horsepower really stuck out to me. I had recently been reading a history of the U.S. naval advisement to the South Vietnamese Navy. And there's all these wonderful details about how the southern fishing community presented a lot of resistance to, being conscripted, or some amount of non-military engagement had to, it was a community that had to be dealt with as opposed to overtaken. So I was just curious if you, from your work, could share anything about particularly how these southern fishing communities moved through refugee exodus or refugee crossing, and maybe if that's too specific, just to ask more broadly about these overlayings of continuities and disruptions of tradition and innovation.
So during the American War, the Mekong Delta had like an inundation of American patrol craft that would patrol then the Mekong Delta's riverways to sort of pick out boats that they deemed suspicious, right? So there were a lot of this river craft that were decommissioned when the war ended, and its parts were basically taken apart, and engines were then sold on the black market. And so many of these engines would be repurposed and often put into smaller Vietnamese coastal vessels to take, many refugees would then install them and take these boats and use them. But oftentimes, the black market was an extremely surveilled space after 1975, and especially into 1976 and 1977, when these materials you were going to be imprisoned if you were seen sort of like negotiating and organizing a boat trip. And so oftentimes people would just use these like very low horsepower engines already built into their riverine craft or watercraft. And I actually, in my longer presentation, I actually talk about the different numbers. The average, I think, kilowatt for a southern boat was around 12 kilowatts. And I also think about then how like many times this is not enough to even go beyond 50 meters from the coastline, let alone 500,000 meters that it takes to get from like the southern tip of Vietnam to the closest first asylum camp in Thailand. And so when I recently returned from Malaysia, and they have all these different like boat arrival lists with basically every boat coming in, broken engine, broken boat, non-functional engine, broken boat. And so basically these were all engines categorized as insufficient for open sea travel. And they were just basically retooled oftentimes to like for people to take and often use to kind of sail. And the differentiation between the southern and northern boats that I kind of briefly talked about is important here because the southern fishing vessels often had engines even if they were really weak. A lot of northern boats leaving from Haiphong, for example, often just had sails because that was the difference between having access to wartime materials and supplies. Thank you.
This is a question to Julia. Like towards the end of your presentation, you kind of pointed out this concept of the global Asia novel, which as someone who also does literary studies, I find this to be super interesting. So I don't know. Could you just like talk a little bit more about that concept? Like what makes a novel global Asia, and how does this term help us understand like literary productions of diaspora and other like contexts?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea behind it, in connection to what I've been hearing on this panel, is this idea of modes of conveyance as being a key part. And, when we think of global Asias, of course, we think migration, right? And the overlooked part of that equation, and even in my presentation, I focus on railroads, but I don't talk about the boats that people took. Like in Dance of the Jacaranda, Babu arrives on and I don't know how to pronounce it, it's a DHOW, it's a particular form of South Asian boat. And he talks about airplanes at the end because his grandson is ultimately deported out of the country, or almost deported out of the country. And he's at an airport, like he's waiting to get on a plane, essentially. And so I think the idea is that those modes of conveyance should be, those are part of the material part of that experience and should be examined. And it offers us a way of thinking about global Asias that is distinguished then from something like the post-colonial novel, with which it would have a great deal in common, or like novels of the global South. That's another subgenre that I think it would overlap with tremendously. But it also offers a way of thinking about different kinds of global Asia's communities that would not otherwise maybe be in conversation for different reasons, right? But it's a way, you know, I'm thinking about what Tina said about what Global Asia is. Tina, over there. And this is offering like an avenue for thinking about those communities in relation to each other without, you know, without dismissing or without overlooking the vastly different ways in which these communities were constituted. So yeah. So thinking about it in like if we think of Global Asia as maybe as a material, right, based on materiality of transport, of transit. If migration is going to be the sort of one of the deciding factors of it, then looking at that is, I think, a way of concretizing or sort of grounding the genre a little bit.
Thank you so much for the presentations. I really, really enjoyed it. And my question's kind of evolving one, and it's for the entire panel. I really like some of the keywords that emerged from your discussions. One was the spatialization of mobility and, of course, the modes of conveyance. And I was sort of thinking a little bit from the perspective of a materiality of these mobilities and bodies that being moved or bodies that being utilized to create this mobility possible. And, sorry. So when we sort of think about, you know, boats in ocean space, cars and roads, and trains and railroads, right? Sort of they are, I mean, constituents of a one system, nonetheless, they're different. Space and the vehicles, right? And then we can also think about different senses of ownership. So individuals who owns, or families, car owners. Obviously, I don't know who owns the trains, perhaps the state or the companies, but obviously there's an ownership that you're in, sort of evoking, which is kind of the laboring bodies of the laborers who built them. So from that perspective, these are different sets of technologies, right? Trains cannot operate outside of railroads. Cars mostly on the roads, but cars can go awry, right? Boats are, I think it's a very interesting case because you can't sort of, you know, transcend a certain visible ocean space by navigating. So if you sort of think about this from this perspective, can we think about somehow different agential relationship between the users, operators, and the regimes of infrastructure? It could be state, it could be empire, it could be, you know, something else. And I'm just speculating here with this line of thoughts and how all these papers are somehow, to me, kind of configuring this landscape of global Asias with all these different human and state actors that is tied through these technologies of mobility and space. Does it make sense? I mean, I'm not really articulating any question here, but if you can share your thoughts about that, that would be really wonderful.
Thank you for that question. So the railroads that I was talking about in my presentation are both like private entities. They're being financed by the state, but it's basically for the enrichment of a very small class of people, with the idea that we think of infrastructure as a public good, but the train, at least in both of these instances, was always meant to enrich a very small clique of people and presented under this rhetoric of you know, benevolence or a gift to the colony, like the quote I read from about the British Railway in the British Museum. In terms of like differential agential relationships, I like how you put that, between individuals and the systems that these modes of transit are embedded in. You have, in the case of the railroad, you have like the individuals who are constructing, right? They're building it. But then you also have the people who are riding the train, right? Or working on the train as conductors or maids, like station agents, et cetera. And so within those within those relationships, you have, again, different kinds of relations to capital, to the state, to empire. Michel de Certeau talks about riding the train as an act of very, like, he talks about it in terms of space, right? Spatial, like space versus place. And the train is a form of discipline. If you're a passenger, you have to sit in a certain spot, you have to go through certain turnstiles, you have to do certain things. But that there are these moments or spaces of momentary, like spaces of, he doesn't say freedom, but where you're not being observed, where you can break the rules, right? And it's in those individual moments where you sort of don't follow the rules that those spaces or those spaces lose their kind of disciplinary power for a moment. And so it really is, when I say the railroad is like polyvalent, it really is, it depends on if you're working on it or if you're riding it or if you're working for it. All of those things really impact, right, the experience of it.
I'll try to be, this answer could get, like, I could talk for a very long time about the agential sort of aspect of thinking about boats, because, you know, boats, refugee boats in particular, can and are fugitive, but they are not navigated on their own. You know, they are embedded in logistical supply chains that are both informal and formal. Informal in the sense that people take months, sometimes years, to plan an escape. They are building boats actively, anticipating departure, right? So that means gathering supplies, burying fuel, burying water, burying engines if they are managed to get it from the black markets. And then once they're at sea, they are often seeking rescue from passing ships or refueling or dried food and water from fishermen that they pass. And so they're always embedded in these like relations among people. But I think on a material level, boats are also very much tied to these connections in terms of if the boat breaks down, then they need a skilled engineer on board to fix an engine. Or if they are lost in a storm, only a fisherman can, you know, be able to tell cardinal directions. And if they don't have either, which many people don't, they have maps stolen from like American atlas books or high school textbooks, and so, or compasses from the American maritime supply as well. So like all of these different object-subject relations really build out a sort of like material world of boat migration.
Going back to trains, I think the train is very, the tracks are, they're attached to the space. You cannot kind of separate them in a way where once the logistical rationale enters, the environment becomes infrastructure. To a complete level, from what are the metals, the wood that you need, the water to operate it. So in that sense, you cannot separate it from a bigger industrialization of the space and the creation of the stations. And again, with the colonial project, it's always like, you know, you create the first museum, you establish your presence there in many different ways, right? So you try to really materialize your presence. And of course, as I said, like the camels were used to like build most of that and a lot of indigenous materials at the beginning. But also the part where you say that trains cannot exist outside of the tracks, I think they can. And they become, in some ways, they become the spaces that this transit is attached. And here I want to like think about the deportations, mass deportations happening during the Stalin, where Koreans, Chechens, Polacks, Germans were sent to Central Asia, and the trains that we used, right, this Stalipin train where the whole three families up to like 20 people are fit into one kind of space with no like space to sit or something, anything, and the livestock or any kind of like small materials they can take with themselves. They go in that train, right? So those Stalipin cars, and they actually come from the settler colonial movements. They were just reappropriated for, again, the carceral movement, for the deportations. They really become this space in a lot of like both novels and memoirs, and even in the commemoration museums, where the transit of subjecthood happens, right? Where you completely lose your understanding of the space. You send somewhere where you don't know language, you don't know the climate, and you don't know whether you will survive. And a lot of people died in that transit. So in that sense, I think they can operate and send and be a certain, establish a certain material presence. And currently, they're also like the red kind of Soviet cars with with the star, it's established on all the stations that were formed specifically by the state. So in that sense, there is monumentalization again. There was nothing else here before the trains came. So I think trains, they still can carry a sense without the tracks. And one last thing, I think there is also, if we think about it, the tracks of different countries, they are different lengths. So when the cargoes come from China, they have to be lifted up and changed towards the different trains to operate. And again, this is because the whole Soviet Union has a different widths to separate itself both from China and from the Europe. So I think in that sense, there is also, it dictates different stoppages and orientations.
I'll make two quick points. One, on ownership. In the longer version of this, I ask specifically why it is that it is the American car, right, that becomes an aspirational sort of object of ownership in the Philippines, and how that relates to the post-colonial condition. But I think there is a way in which there's a distinction here. Cars and boats can be owned in ways that, that airplanes and railroads cannot, and that they play a crucial role in livelihood and mobility, et cetera, right? That's worth kind of thinking about. Secondly, on your second part of the question, in the history of technology, there's a very careful distinction between the operator of a technology and the user of a technology, which can be a much wider range of people. And here I think it's important to kind of triangulate, and I think the bus is a way to think about this, right? Someone owns it, someone operates it, someone uses it, right? And in all different kinds of ways. And so, I don't have huge insight into that, but yeah.
I guess in the spirit of that last question, it also made me think about Adrian bringing up the Duterte example, and knowing that in Cebu, Philippines, it was actually bridge projects, right? So thinking about materiality of, it's not a road, but it's bridges as these kinds of shortcuts, right? And that for Duterte, it became a different type of nationalist project, which is to say it actually became an extension of his diplomatic relationship with China, right? Because then who got contracted to build those bridges, and which laborers, right, came into the country. So yeah, that's just, thank you for that question. And I think also too, I guess my specific question to Chris is, your presentation made me think a lot about how people in the aftermath of kind of martial law and the Marcos years thinks about, says, oh, it was a time of, not just discipline, but also improved roads, right? That he improved the roads. And so I wonder in your work, if we can think of, I don't know, Marcos or any kind of post-World War II Philippine president, right? And those examples as an extension of what you're calling the co-constitutive relationship between empire and maybe in this case, post-colony.
Yes, that's and in some ways there's a sequel. There's a part two of this paper, which actually starts in 1945 with that moment of switching from the left to the right side of the road, and then traces kind of the ways in which the automobile industry in the United States is deeply connected to the history of to aspirations of Philippine economic development, right? And the intense connections, right, between that lead to auto factories, all those sorts of things, and that reached their peak during the martial law period, right, under Marcos, and then the ways in which that collapses that co-constitutes with the collapse of the U.S. auto industry. Right, and the fact that even if the SUV is the aspirational form of car ownership in the Philippines, they're more likely to be Toyotas than Fords today, right? And that I think that the way in which the kind of reorientation after 1986 of Philippine political economy is also part of a kind of reorientation of the global auto industry.
this is a question for everyone, and it's about, it really comes out of just how I think generative this analytic is of moving objects and objects that, cause movement. I'm thinking here about how for each of these, they're moving things and people, but also in order to kind of create these infrastructural projects and then also make sure that, they keep moving, there's also all sorts of movement that are required. So for instance, Julia, you already talked a little bit about how for kind of a railroad project, it necessitates, the movement of people for labor and also material for building. But also thinking about, for instance, when things break down, when things stop moving, how, that then catalyzes other movements, right, to kind of keep the movement going. And I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit about that, but also thinking about where do you kind of, how far do we zoom out, how close do we zoom in thinking about just how many different forms of mobilities and how much movement or, is there in all of this together?
I'll start with one little thing, which is what's missing, I think, from our panel, which I think gets to this question of things sort of not moving and mobilities that break down. And that's that we didn't, I think, pay enough attention to the natural world, right? The natural environment on which all this infrastructure stands. And I am not a literary historian, so I'll get in trouble here. But I was inspired listening to Julia. The canonical book, Carlos Pulisson's *America in the Heart*, right, has this passage where the main character, and protagonist, is involved in building the Baguio Road, right? But it keeps getting washed out, right? So rain and mud have this kind of, I don't want to call it agential, but why not, right? Right? Sort of role in the narrative, and I think also for all of these transportations, I think just moving forward, right? That nature needs to be part of that conversation.
Yeah, just to piggyback off that, I mean, nature is so important when on a boat, especially, and there are many times I would read these oral testimonies, and they will say monsoon season, so I don't go, or maybe it is monsoon season, so I go because police presence guarding the borders is less prevalent, especially leaving from Vietnam. But one aspect that I think about a lot in my work is the use of communication via radio that determines whether or not people leave. So many civilians living in Vietnam in the late 70s and 80s who still had possession of radios from wartime were listening to Voice of America and BBC broadcasts in the middle of the night, listening for news of whether the US was accepting refugees or whether camps were open or closing. And that actually played along with the numbers of people that were leaving and then arriving at different shores. And so this is another form of relation and communication that plays into moving objects, right? Radios may not move, but people are listening, and that determines whether or not they do. And so that's just another point.
I just wanted to say, because I think this is really interesting, in thinking about movement that stops or movement breaking, what happens when movement breaks down. And part of me thinks that movement is always breaking down, things are always stopping, right? The narrative of progress is always that things are moving forward, and we only notice, that's the line about infrastructure. You only notice it when it fails, right? When it doesn't work for some reason. But I think failure is baked into infrastructure. Infrastructure is always premised on certain bodies being of more value than others that deserve more protection, whether that's clean water or clean air or good public transportation or whatever it is. And so it isn't, movement is always in the process of stopping. I think that's always the anxiety, is that people will notice that it isn't actually going anywhere, right? And so that would be kind of my take on that, I think, that it's just thinking about it as an infrastructural project, it's always on the verge of failure. Failure is baked into the system, basically.
Yeah, I can add just a small remark that with things also empires break. So I think in the case of kind of united economic system, the collapse of Soviet Union, and again the establishment of independent states and civil wars happening in Tajikistan, and then Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan having more close borders for a long time. That has been an issue, and especially where you when all your water sources are connected, all your industries are connected, the logistics had to fail. So even the travel between bordering countries has been an issue for a longer time, and until the relationships also are negotiated and new tracks are built. So and the other thing, yes, actually empires, they do invest into those infrastructures at the beginning, or kind of at the moment where they're trying to establish themselves in space. So all of that infrastructure was itself deteriorated and just not functional by the end of 90s, because a lot of it was kind of built between the period of the 30s and 50s.
Yeah, thank you all for a fantastic panel. I was just noticing a number of comments that were relating to language and infrastructure. Anne, you just talked about radio. Anel, earlier you were talking about people arriving and not knowing whether they would know the new language. So I was just curious if any of you had comments about the way infrastructures also move languages, both in the interest of empire and state and nation building, but also they create vernacular languages like Trapik, which is so interesting. So I just wondered if you had more thoughts on the way infrastructure and language often go together, but both in terms of power and domination, but also possibly resistance and vernacularization.
So yeah, the railroad actually has been instrumental in how we think about moving images, right? So a lot of the language of the railroad, tracking, that is all that gets imported or sort of appropriated into the language of photography, and especially moving like a film, right? So the railroad trains us basically to understand life at speed, which is represented then visually on film. And so one of the earliest genres of film is, and this is before narrative cinema took over in the early part of the 20th century, it was just a camera on a cow catcher and photographing or recording the train as it was moving through the landscape. And so it's like an early version of watching YouTube videos where people are barreling down mountains on their mountain bikes or whatever, or skiing or whatever, that sense of motion. And so that language of the railroad, the way at which we experience the railroad bodily, Wolfgang Schivelbusch talks about this, right, is the sort of the way we think about modernity, like our life within a modern context.
Yeah, I'll just say quickly that one of the most language questions that I always have is the use of the term boat people, right? And for my project, I was on and off about using quotation marks around boat people, especially because in the diaspora, many boat refugees will call themselves boat people easily, and that's a term in which they find identification, locate a sort of memory of that passage. But in the term itself, boat people, didn't come about in Western discourse until about 2.5 years after the start of boat migrations. That had started already in 1975 with the evacuations of allies from Saigon, and many people were taking their own boats and leaving the fallen city of Saigon. But they weren't categorized as boat refugees then because of the presence of the US ships that were there. So how boat people came about was, even though people were already leaving on vessels in 1976, 1977, they were labeled boat cases or land cases in the documents. Boat people really only came about, in quotation marks actually, in US and British and also other Western documents, when the issue of Southeast Asian pushback and supposedly inhumanity came up as a topic that they were these refugees were experiencing inhospitable shores. They were the pitiful victims of Southeast Asian inhumanity, and also they had no safe harbor. So then boat people became associated with unseaworthy vessels, small boats that were leaky, decrepit. And so this imagination of the boat people as that group of mass of cramped, overcrowded Vietnamese refugees on small boats, this really emerged in a moment of heightened sort of pushback in Southeast Asia.
I mentioned in the presentation the transference of newspapers, and the printing itself throughout the region was stimulated by the railroads. Again, it created a pan-Turkic movement and communication. So in that sense, it's again, I think there are two sides to it, right? That people also use it for their own means, right? But the other, the question of communication was very central for the party, since they now have the vast territory that speaks in the different languages, and the first harbors of what they were sending were actually propaganda trains and boats called agitation trains or agit trains, and they would be that's where the first movies were also shown, right? Dziga Viertev's, for example, and because films were something, especially the silent films, something that could transcend the language or give the spirit of the revolution. We don't know how perceptive people were. There's no kind of how they were responding to it is a different question. And again, they were also at the same time military trained, so they were also suppressing the uprisings in the region. So they had the double function of literacy and again establishing the Soviet rule or Bolshevik rule. Interestingly, I think it's also the propaganda trains are used nowadays in Russia, and again, one of the latest railroads, Baikal-Amur magistral, was this grand idea of permafrost being subdued to the industrial presence, and so the language of the militarification moves all along, and the kids participate in those trains. They go from the region to the region to do the agitation work. So I think there is the whole repertoire that's been developed connected to the trains, and both in terms of bringing the tools to combat the illiteracy, but at the same time creating specific narratives of how people could express themselves later on.
So let's give a round of applause to our speakers.